My house was destroyed by a devastating fire when I was 65 years old. I went to find shelter at my son's house, but he turned me away, saying his girlfriend needed her privacy. Desperate, I called my first love, a man I hadn't seen in 4 decades. When he opened the door to his mansion, he said 3 words: "You finally came back." My life changed forever. But before I continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and write in the comments, where are you watching this video from? We love to know how far our stories travel. My name is Gabrielle, and at 65, I thought I had already experienced every kind of suffering life could offer. I was wrong. It all started on a Wednesday that seemed just like any other in my quiet suburban town. I was in the kitchen making my afternoon coffee when I smelled something strange. I decided to check, thinking maybe I'd left something on the stove. When I opened the living room door, I was met by a wall of smoke so thick I could barely see through it. Flames were already consuming the curtains and climbing the walls with a speed that left me paralyzed for a few crucial seconds. The smoke detector should have gone off, but I found out later the battery had died months ago. A simple oversight that would cost me everything I owned. I ran back to the kitchen trying to reach the phone to call the fire department, but the smoke was already everywhere, making it hard to breathe, impossible to think clearly. I heard glass shattering and realized I didn't have time. The flames were consuming my house with a ravenous hunger that seemed impossible to contain. My only thought was to get out of there alive. I grabbed my purse, which was on the kitchen table, and ran for the back door. The last thing I saw before I left was the portrait of Richard, my late husband, starting to blacken from the heat. The neighbors were already on the street when I got out, coughing and stumbling. Mrs. Evans, my 78-year-old neighbor, was the first to approach, hugging me as we both watched helpless as the flames devoured the house where I had lived for over 40 years. The firefighters arrived in 10 minutes, but it was already too late. They managed to prevent the fire from spreading to the neighboring houses, but mine was beyond saving. In just 1 hour, 4 decades of memories were reduced to ashes. The kitchen table where my son David used to do his homework, the walls that held his childhood growth, marks the bedroom I shared with Richard for 37 years. It was all gone. I stood on the sidewalk, wrapped in a blanket someone had put over my shoulders while the firefighters did their work. They would later tell me it was probably a short circuit in an old outlet in the living room, a simple electrical problem that turned my life into ruins. The flames finally died down, leaving only a blackened, smoking frame. The fire chief approached me, his face dirty with soot, his eyes full of a compassion I couldn't bear at that moment. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. We did what we could, but..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. I could see it for myself. Total loss. Everything I owned besides the clothes on my back and the contents of my purse was gone. The neighbors, who were lucky enough to still have homes, took me in for the first night. Sweet Mrs. Evans insisted I stay with her, but her small apartment was already crowded with her visiting grandchildren. The Red Cross had set up emergency shelters, but the thought of sleeping in a gym full of strangers made me feel even more lost. That's when I knew I had to call David. My son lives about 40 minutes away in Oak Creek, a fancy neighborhood with tree-lined streets and houses that look like they're from magazines. He moved there 4 years ago when he was promoted to regional manager at the insurance company where he works. We weren't close, not in the way mothers and sons should be, but he was all the family I had left. I used his phone because mine had melted along with everything else. "David, honey, it's Mom," I said, my voice weaker than I intended. "Mom, what's wrong? You sound upset." "There was a fire, son. The house, it's gone. Everything's gone." There was a pause that felt like an eternity. "Are you hurt?" "No, I'm fine. Just some scrapes and a sore throat from the smoke, but I need a place to stay while I figure things out, just temporarily." Another pause. "Of course, Mom, come over. We'll figure it out." The relief that washed over me was so intense, I nearly collapsed. My son would take care of me. Despite all our distance, all the missed calls and awkward holiday dinners, he was still my boy. I spent the next morning looking at the charred ruins, waiting for the insurance adjuster to arrive. He showed up promptly at 9 a.m., a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, walking through what was left of my home with a clipboard and a camera. "Total loss," he said pragmatically, as if those 2 words didn't represent my entire life. How much, I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. Well, you had a standard policy, about $120,000 on the structure, but with your deductible and depreciation, we're looking at maybe $50,000, maybe less. $50,000 to rebuild 42 years of life. It seemed impossible. Mrs. Evans helped me buy some basic clothes and toiletries with the emergency money the Red Cross had given me. Everything I owned now fit into a small borrowed suitcase. That was it. That was all that was left of the life I had built. The drive to David's house felt like a journey to a foreign country. Everything looked different when you have nowhere to go back to. The familiar places, the gas station where I always bought my lottery tickets, the diner where Richard and I used to have breakfast on Sundays, they all seemed to belong to someone else's life now. David's neighborhood was immaculate as always. Perfect lawns, perfect sidewalks, perfect lives that were going on exactly as they had the day before. I felt like an intruder bringing my tragedy into their pristine world. His house was a 2-story colonial with white shutters and a red door that Valerie, his girlfriend, had picked out. I had met her exactly 3 times in the 2 years they'd been together. She was 30 and he was 39. She worked at a marketing firm downtown and had opinions on everything from the color of the walls to the type of wine to serve at dinner. I paid the taxi at his driveway and stood still for a moment, gathering my courage. This is temporary, I told myself. Just until I can figure out what's next. Just until the insurance money comes through and I can find a small apartment somewhere. I never imagined that walking up to my own son's door with my small borrowed suitcase would be one of the hardest things I'd ever done. But as I raised my hand to knock, I felt a familiar sensation. The same sinking feeling I had when Richard died, as if the ground were disappearing beneath my feet. I just didn't know yet how much deeper I was about to fall. David opened the door before I could knock, as if he'd been watching for me from the window. For a single moment, seeing his familiar face, Richard's eyes, my stubborn chin made me feel like everything might be okay. He was my son, my only son. Surely blood meant something. "Mom," he said, stepping aside to let me in, but his voice held something I couldn't quite place. Distance, maybe, or discomfort. Valerie appeared behind him almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting in the wings. She was wearing white jeans and a silk blouse that probably cost more than I used to spend on a month's groceries. Her brown hair was swept up in one of those messy buns that somehow looked perfectly styled, and her smile was the kind that never reached her eyes. "Gabrielle, how awful about your house," she said, but she was looking at my ragged suitcase, not at me. David told me what happened. I set my suitcase down in their immaculate entryway, suddenly aware of how I must look. My newly bought clothes, cheap and plain, looked out of place against the polished marble of the hallway. I could still smell the smoke embedded in my hair, despite the shower I'd taken at Mrs. Evans' house. "It's just temporary," I said quickly, "just until I can get back on my feet." David and Valerie exchanged a look, one of those wordless conversations couples have, the kind that excludes everyone else in the room. I'd seen Richard and I do the same thing countless times, but from the other side it felt like being shut out of a club I didn't know existed. "Let's sit down and talk," David said, guiding me to the living room. His house was beautiful in the way that magazine houses are beautiful. Everything matched, nothing was out of place. White furniture that looked like no one had ever actually sat on it. Glass coffee tables that reflected the light from windows so clean they seemed invisible. It was the kind of house that made you afraid to touch anything. I sat on the edge of the immaculate sofa, my new shoes planted firmly on the flawless hardwood floors. Valerie noticed and flinched slightly. "So what's the plan?" David asked, settling into the armchair across from me. Not next to me on the sofa, where he might have put his arm around his grieving mother, but across from me as if we were conducting business. "Well, the insurance adjuster said it'll take a few weeks to process everything, maybe a month. I was hoping I could stay here until then, just until I find a small apartment or something." The silence that followed lasted about 10 seconds too long. I saw Valerie's face change. I saw her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. She leaned over and put her hand on David's arm, a gesture that looked supportive but was clearly possessive. "Mom," David began, and I knew from his tone that what came next would break my heart. The thing is, Valerie and I have been talking, and we really value our privacy here. We work long hours, and this is our sanctuary, you know. I blinked, not quite understanding. I wouldn't get in your way. I'd keep to myself. I'd help with the cooking, the cleaning. I wouldn't be a bother. Valerie leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. It's not about being a bother, Gabrielle. It's about space. This house is our first home together, and we're still finding our rhythm as a couple. I'm his mother, I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. Of course you are, Valerie replied smoothly. And that's why we thought you'd be more comfortable somewhere else, somewhere you can have your independence while you rebuild. I looked at David, waiting for him to contradict her. To remember that I was the woman who had stayed up with him through every fever, who had worked double shifts to pay for his college textbooks, who had held his hand through his divorce 3 years ago when his ex-wife left him for her personal trainer. Instead, he nodded. Valerie's right, Mom. We thought you'd be happier with your own space. The words hit me like a physical punch. I actually felt my chest tighten as if someone were squeezing my lungs. Happier, David? I lost everything yesterday. Everything. And you think I'd be happier alone in a motel room than here with my family? It doesn't have to be a motel, Valerie said quickly. There are some lovely extended stay places near the mall. Very clean, very safe, and they have little kitchenettes so you can cook for yourself. I stared at this woman who had been in my son's life for only 2 years, telling me where I should live after I lost my home. And how am I supposed to pay for this lovely extended stay place? The insurance money won't come for weeks. David shifted uncomfortably. I could help with that. A few $100s to get you started. A few $100s, as if I were a distant relative he barely knew, not the woman who gave him life. David, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I changed your diapers. I rocked you through your colic. I taught you how to ride a bike, and I helped you with your homework. I held you when you cried because Lucy Vance broke your heart in high school. His face winced slightly, but Valerie squeezed his arm harder. No one is questioning your history, she said. We just think we would all be more comfortable with some boundaries. Boundaries, I'd heard that word from the therapist David had seen after his divorce. Everything was about boundaries. You're kicking me out, I said flatly. We're not kicking you out, David protested. We're just saying maybe this arrangement wouldn't work for anyone. Whose idea was this? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I could see it in the way Valerie sat back slightly satisfied, as if she'd won something. We discussed it together, David said, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. I stood up slowly, my knees cracking in a way that reminded me I was 65 and all alone in the world. I understand. Mom, don't be like that. We're trying to do what's best for everyone. What's best for everyone? I repeated the words as if they were in a foreign language. What would be best for everyone, David, is if your mother didn't have to sleep on the street tonight. Valerie's perfectly made-up face tightened into a concerned frown. You don't have to sleep on the street. Like I said, there are options. I looked around the pristine living room one last time, at the family photos that included David and Valerie, but none of me. At the expensive furniture that no one was allowed to actually live on. At my son, who had chosen this cold, beautiful woman over his own mother. You're right, I said finally. There are always options. I picked up my small suitcase. Its weight felt heavier now that I knew where it wasn't welcome. David stood up, looking uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to change his mind. I'll call you in a few days, he said, as soon as you get settled somewhere. Don't bother, I said, surprised by how firm my voice sounded. I wouldn't want to invade your sanctuary. Valerie had the decency to look slightly ashamed, but not enough to speak up. Not enough to say, wait, this is wrong. She's your mother. I walked out of that perfect house with its perfect couple and their perfect boundaries and stood on the sidewalk for a long time before I could make myself walk away. Through the front window I could see David and Valerie talking probably about how difficult I was being, how much drama I was bringing into their peaceful lives. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent years after Richard died telling myself I was strong, independent, that I didn't need anyone. Now, when I actually needed help, I found out that independence is a luxury you can only afford when you have options. I walked to a small motel around the corner and spent almost all the money I had left on a room for the night. Sitting on the hard bed, staring at the peeling walls, I tried to figure out where a 65-year-old woman with almost no money and only a suitcase of cheap clothes was supposed to go. That's when I remembered the business card I had carried in my wallet for almost 40 years, miraculously saved because it was with me at the time of the fire. Yellowed with age and soft from being handled so much. A card I never thought I would actually use from a man I loved when the world was young and anything seemed possible. Robert Dawson, the man who promised to come back for me one day, before life got in the way, and one day never came. I spent 3 nights in that cheap motel before I found the courage to make the call. 3 nights waking up with a backache from the thin mattress and the taste of shame in my mouth. 3 nights listening to fights in the hallway and the constant hum of traffic through the poorly insulated window. 3 nights washing my few new clothes in the tiny bathroom sink and hanging them to dry on the room's only chair. The business card felt like tissue paper in my fingers, worn thin from 4 decades of being carried but never used. Robert Dawson was written in faded blue ink. Underneath it, a phone number with an area code I didn't recognize. On the back, in my own youthful handwriting, "Never forget G." I had written those words when I was 25, believing with the absolute certainty of youth that Robert Dawson would be the great love of my life. He was 26, with dark hair that fell over his forehead and eyes the color of golden amber. He was working for his father's construction company after college and dreamed of bigger things, of building something that mattered. We dated for 9 months, which at 25 felt like an eternity. He used to take me to the lookout point in the hills just outside of town, where we would sit on the hood of his car and talk about our plans. "I'm going to start my own business," he'd tell me. "Something with construction or real estate development, something that will make me rich enough to give you everything you deserve." "I'll come back for you, Gabrielle," he promised the night before he left for a project in the city. "I'll make something of myself, and then I'll come back and marry you." But promises at 25 have a way of fading when real life takes over. He wrote letters at first, long, passionate letters full of dreams and plans. I wrote back telling him about my job at the bank, about how I was waiting for him, how he promised. Then the letters got shorter, less frequent. By the time I met Richard 6 months later at a church event, Robert felt like a beautiful dream I once had, too good to be true. Richard was stable, reliable, already 32 with a good job at the phone company. He didn't promise me the world, but he promised me a home, a family security. When he proposed after 5 months of dating, I said yes. I put Robert's business card in the pocket of my wedding dress, a secret talisman I couldn't bring myself to throw away. Now, 40 years later, sitting in a cheap motel room that smelled of damp and old cigarettes, I wondered what had become of that dreamy man with the amber eyes. I kept track of him sporadically over the years, the way you do with first loves. Through mutual friends, I heard he had made good on his promises, that he had started a construction company that had become something big. He never married, which surprised people. Too busy building his empire, they'd say. That Dawson was always ambitious. The last I'd heard, maybe 8 years ago, was that his company had expanded beyond our state to Chicago and Dallas. Dawson Development's building shopping malls and office complexes. The young man from the construction company had become the kind of man who wore expensive suits and made decisions that affected hundreds of people. What would that man want with a 65-year-old widow staying in a cheap motel with nothing but a suitcase of clothes from the supermarket? The rational part of my brain said it was ridiculous, pathetic even. You don't call someone after 40 years because your life has fallen apart. You don't look up your high school sweetheart when you're old and desperate and have nowhere else to go. But rational thought is a luxury when you're counting the change in your purse and trying to figure out if you have enough for one more night in a motel. On the 4th morning, I couldn't take it anymore. My back ached from the hard mattress. The money was running out, and the hotel had already warned me they would need the room for a reservation arriving the next day. I sat at the room's small table staring at the card, my hands shaking from more than just the morning chill. What would I say? "Hi, Robert. Remember me. I'm homeless now. Can you help?" The number on the card was probably disconnected, Or it would ring to some secretary who would politely inform me that Mr. Dawson was far too important to take calls from random women claiming to have known him in his youth. But what if it wasn't? What if he answered? My heart pounded as I dialed the number. Each digit felt like a step off a cliff. It rang once, twice. Dawson Developments, Robert speaking. His voice was deeper now, shaped by time and responsibility, but it was unmistakably his. After 40 years, I would have known it anywhere. I almost hung up, almost pressed the end call button, and walked away to find some other solution. But something in his tone, some warmth that seemed to travel through the phone and wrap around me like a blanket, made me speak. "Robert, it's Gabrielle Mendoza. Well, I'm Gabrielle Sanchez now, but I used to be Mendoza." Silence long enough that I thought maybe the call had dropped, or maybe he had hung up, or maybe he had no idea who I was. Then, Gabrielle. Just my name said like a prayer or a wonder, as if he couldn't believe it. "I'm so sorry to call like this." I rushed the words, tumbling over each other in my desperation to explain before he could hang up. "I know it's been a long time and I probably shouldn't be calling, but I didn't know who else." "Where are you?" He interrupted, his voice sharp with concern. "I'm in town at a motel called the Rest Stop, and I know this sounds crazy, but my house burned down last week. I lost everything, and my son doesn't want me to stay with him, and I have nowhere to go." The words came out in a flood, each one harder to say than the last. Admitting your own child had rejected you was like admitting you had failed at the most fundamental part of being human. "Give me the exact address," Robert said, his voice all business now. "I'm coming to get you." "You don't have to do that. I don't know why I called. I guess I just needed to hear a friendly voice." "Gabrielle?" His tone allowed no argument. "Tell me where you are. I'm already walking to my car." Over the phone, I could hear the sound of a door closing and engine starting. He was really coming. This man I hadn't spoken to in 40 years was dropping whatever important business he was doing to rescue me from a cheap motel. I gave him the address, my voice barely a whisper. "Robert, I'm not the girl you remember." "Neither am I," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "But I've been waiting 40 years for this call." After we hung up, I spent the next hour packing my few things, alternating between panic and disbelief. What was I doing? What were we doing? This was insane. You couldn't just pick up relationships after 4 decades as if you were continuing a conversation from yesterday. But as I watched out the motel window waiting for a car, I wouldn't recognize carrying a man I might not recognize. I felt something I hadn't felt since before the fire. Hope. Maybe it was foolish hope. Maybe it would lead to more disappointment, more heartbreak. But it was hope all the same. And at 65, with nothing left to lose, hope was worth the risk. At 10:45 on the dot, a silver Mercedes pulled up in front of the motel, sleek and gleaming against the worn-out backdrop of the street. I watched from the window as the car parked, my heart beating against my ribs like a bird trying to escape its cage. The windows were tinted so I couldn't see inside, but something deep in my chest told me it was him. The engine cut off and the driver's side door opened. Even after 40 years, even with gray hair and lines around his eyes, even carrying the weight of decades I hadn't shared with him, I recognized him immediately. Robert Dawson stepped out of that car like he was stepping out of my dreams, and when he looked up at the window where I was standing, the years crumbled away between us as if they'd never existed. I grabbed my suitcase and went downstairs in a rush like someone afraid a dream will vanish if you wait too long. He was standing by the car waiting for me. Robert had the same relaxed confidence he'd had at 26, but now it was refined, polished by success and maturity. He was wearing dark jeans and a navy blue sweater that probably cost more than I used to spend on a month's groceries. But his eyes, those amber eyes that had haunted my dreams for decades, were exactly the same. I wanted to hide, wanted to go back to the room and pretend this wasn't happening. I looked terrible. My hair hadn't been cut in months. My cheap clothes were wrinkled, and I felt small and insignificant compared to the elegant man waiting for me. But he was already smiling at me, a smile that made my heart leap as if I were 25 again. I walked toward him slowly, suddenly unable to breathe. "Hello, Gabrielle," he said softly. Up close, I could see the changes time had made. His dark hair was now silver, cut short and professional. Lines marked the corners of his eyes and shaped his mouth. He was broader in the shoulders, more solid, as if success had given him physical weight along with everything else. But when he smiled at me, I saw the young man who used to drive me to the lookout and tell me about his dreams. "Hello," I managed to say. My voice was barely a whisper. He studied my face for a long moment, those amber eyes taking in every detail. I wanted to apologize for how I looked, for how far I'd fallen for calling him after all these years with nothing to offer but trouble. Instead, he said 3 words that changed everything. "You look beautiful." I started to cry. Right there on the sidewalk in front of that cheap motel, with Robert Dawson standing beside me, I completely fell apart. 40 years of unshed tears, 4 days of uncertainty and despair, a lifetime of being told I wasn't enough. It all came out in ugly, ragged sobs I couldn't control. He didn't say anything else. He didn't try to shush me or tell me it would be okay. He simply took my suitcase with one hand and wrapped his other arm around me as I collapsed against his chest. He smelled like expensive cologne and clean laundry, like success and stability, like everything I had lost and everything I never had. His sweater was soft against my cheek, and his arms were strong around my shaking shoulders. "I'm sorry," I gasped against his chest. "I'm sorry, Robert, I shouldn't have called. I shouldn't have dragged you into this mess." "Shh," he murmured, his hand stroking my back. "You should have called years ago." When the tears finally stopped, I pulled back to look at him, embarrassed by the wet patch I'd left on his expensive sweater. I must look like a mess. He reached out and wiped a tear from my cheek, his touch as soft as a whisper. "You look like someone who has been through hell and survived. That's not a mess, Gabrielle. That's strength." I laughed, but it came out shaky and bitter. "Strength? I'm 65 years old. I'm staying in a dumpy motel because my own son won't have me. That's not strength. That's pathetic." His jaw tightened, and for a moment I saw a flash of the anger he was trying to hide. "Your son is a fool. You don't know him. I don't need to know him. I know you." He paused, his hands still resting gently on my shoulders. "Or at least I knew you, and the Gabrielle Mendoza I knew would never turn away someone in need, especially family." The way he said my maiden name like it was something precious he had saved all these years made my chest ache with longing for the woman I used to be. "That was a long time ago," I said. "I'm not that girl anymore." "Maybe not," he agreed. "But I'd like to get to know the woman she became." He put my suitcase in the trunk of his luxury car as if it were a treasure, not a cheap bag holding everything I had left in the world. As he opened the passenger door for me, I was momentarily paralyzed by the unreality of the situation. The morning of the fire, I had a house, memories, a life built over decades. Now I was getting into the car of a man I hadn't seen in 40 years, with no idea what was coming next. "Where are we going?" I asked as he started the engine. "Home," he said simply. The drive took almost an hour through increasingly wealthy neighborhoods until we reached an area I had never seen before. Rolling hills dotted with estates, hidden behind stone walls and iron gates. Trees that looked like they had been professionally placed. Mailboxes that probably cost more than most people's cars. Robert turned into a long driveway marked only by a small brass plaque that read, "Dawson." The driveway curved through mature trees and manicured gardens before opening into a circular drive in front of a house that took my breath away. It wasn't showy or ostentatious. It was elegant in the way that real money is elegant. Understated, confident, built to last. Stone and wood with tall windows that caught the afternoon light, and a porch that invited you to sit and stay a while. "Robert," I whispered, staring at this monument to everything he had accomplished. This is incredible." He parked the car but didn't get out right away. Instead, he sat there looking at the house as if he were seeing it through my eyes. "It's too big," he said quietly. "Always has been. I built it thinking I'd fill it up one day, but—" He shrugged. A gesture so familiar it made my heart ache. Some dreams don't work out the way you plan. You never married. The question slipped out before I could stop it. He turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. I came close a couple of times, but something was always missing. He hesitated for an instant, then said simply, "You." The word hung between us in the quiet car loaded with 40 years of what-ifs and might-have-beens. I wanted to ask what he meant. I wanted to understand how I could have been missing from a life I was never a part of. But before I could find the words, he was already getting out of the car, coming around to open my door. The house was even more stunning inside. Hardwood floors that glowed like honey-high ceilings, furniture that looked like it belonged in architectural magazines, but it didn't feel cold or museum-like. There were books everywhere, comfortable reading chairs set near windows, pictures scattered on side tables. It felt like a home where someone actually lived, not just a showcase for success. "Are you hungry?" Robert asked, leading me to a kitchen that was larger than my entire old living room. "I was about to make lunch when you called." I realized I was starving. The motel breakfast had been just a stale roll and weak coffee, and my stomach was cramping from emptiness and nerves. "I don't want to be any trouble," I started. But he cut me off with a look. "Gabrielle, stop. You're not trouble. You're—" He paused, searching for the words. "You're the answer to a question I've been asking for 40 years. While he cooked, and he really could cook, moving around that huge kitchen with the ease of someone who had learned to take care of himself, I studied the photographs scattered around the room. Robert at groundbreaking ceremonies, cutting ribbons, shaking hands with important people. Robert with various women at charity galas and business dinners, always smiling, but never looking completely happy. "Tell me about your life," he said, placing a plate of perfectly roasted chicken and vegetables in front of me. "Tell me about Richard, about your son, about everything I missed." So I did. Over a lunch that tasted like heaven, after days of horrible motel food, I told him about my marriage to Richard. Richard steady and comfortable, who gave me security and companionship, if not passion. About David, the baby I had wanted so desperately and loved so fiercely, who grew up to be a stranger who valued his girlfriend's comfort over his mother's needs. I told him about the years of being a good wife, a good mother, a good widow, about the fire that had taken everything I owned and the son who had taken everything I had left. Robert listened without interrupting, his amber eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I'm sorry about Richard and your house and your son, but I'm not sorry you called me." "Why?" The question came out smaller than I intended. He reached across the table and took my hand in his. Still strong, still gentle, still able to make my heart race after all these years. "Because I never stopped loving you," he said quietly. "Because every deal I made, every success I had, every dollar I earned, it was all so I could be worthy of you when you came back to me." Robert, I know this sounds crazy. I know 40 years is a long time and we're different people now. But when I heard your voice on that phone today, it was like the missing piece of my life finally clicked into place. I looked down at our joined hands, his tanned and well-cared for, mine worn from work and showing every day of my 65 years. "I'm not the girl you remember." "No," he agreed. "You're better. You're real. You've lived and loved and lost and survived. That 25-year-old girl was pretty, but she was just potential. You're the woman that potential grew into." The words settled around my heart like a warm blanket, healing wounds I didn't even know I still carried. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt seen not as someone's mother or someone's wife or someone's burden, but as myself. "What happens now?" I asked. Robert smiled, that same devastating smile that made me fall for him when the world was young. "Now we find out what the rest of our lives look like. Together, if you'll have me." As I sat in his beautiful kitchen filled with good food and possibility, I realized that sometimes the fire that destroys your old life is just making room for the life you were always meant to have. Living with Robert was like discovering a version of myself I'd forgotten existed. The first week was strange, tiptoeing around each other like polite strangers sharing a space. He gave me the entire guest suite of his home, a bedroom larger than my old living room, a private bathroom with a tub that would fit 2 people, and a small sitting room overlooking his gardens. I felt like I was staying in a luxury hotel, afraid to touch anything or leave too much evidence of my presence. But Robert was patient the way successful men learn to be. And gradually, I started to relax. He had a housekeeper, Linda, who came 3 days a week. But on the other days, I found myself cooking for him. It started small, making coffee in the mornings, preparing simple lunches. But Robert appreciated everything with the enthusiasm of someone who had been eating buffet meals and restaurant food for decades. "This is incredible," he said one night, savoring the stew I'd made using my grandmother's recipe. "I haven't had a home-cooked meal like this in years." "It's nothing fancy," I protested, but inside I was glowing. When was the last time anyone had appreciated my cooking? David used to complain that I made the same 5 dishes over and over. Valerie once suggested I try more contemporary flavors for family dinners. Robert shook his head. "It's perfect. You're perfect." That word perfect should have made me uncomfortable. I was 65 with gray roots showing and laugh lines that had turned into permanent furrows. My hands were spotted with age, my body soft in places that used to be firm. I was anything but perfect. But when Robert looked at me, I saw myself reflected in his eyes as someone beautiful, someone worthy of love and attention and gentle care. We fell into routines that felt as natural as breathing. We had breakfast together on the back porch, where Robert would read business reports and I would watch the birds at his elaborate feeders. We took afternoon walks around the property where he showed me the gardens he had planted himself and the greenhouse where he grew orchids as a hobby. The evenings were for talking. We had 40 years to catch up on, and we did it slowly, carefully, like archaeologists examining precious artifacts. I told him how hard it had been to lose Richard, about the emptiness of the house in the months that followed, about how I had to force myself to get out of bed each morning, about the loneliness of widowhood, the way people treat you like half a person once your husband is gone. He told me about his business, how it had grown from a small construction firm to a development empire with projects in 3 states, about the women he dated over the years. Smart, accomplished women who looked perfect on his arm at charity galas, but who never made him feel whole. "There was one woman," he said one night as we sat near his fireplace, the rain tapping against the windows. "Ellen. She was an architect, brilliant, beautiful. Everyone said we were perfect for each other." I felt a pang of jealousy that surprised me with its intensity. "What happened?" "I proposed," he said quietly. "On Christmas Eve 5 years ago. Big production restaurant overlooking the city, expensive ring, everything she'd said she wanted. And she said yes. We planned the wedding for the following summer. But as the date got closer, I just kept having this feeling that something was wrong. Not with her. She was everything anyone could want in a wife. But with me." He paused, staring into the fire. "The night before the wedding, I called it off." "Robert, no. What did you tell her?" "The truth." He looked at me, then his amber eyes serious. That I was still in love with a woman I had known 40 years ago, and it wouldn't be fair to marry her while my heart belonged to someone else. The words hit me like a physical blow. "You called off your wedding for me, for the memory of me, for the possibility that one day somehow I might need you and you would be here waiting." I looked at him, at this successful, handsome man who could have had anyone, and I tried to process what he was telling me. "This is insane," I said. "Is it—" He leaned forward, taking my hands in his. "Is it any more insane than you keeping my business card in your wallet for 40 years? He had a point. Of course, we were both insane. We were both living with the ghosts of what might have been. But somehow, against all odds, our particular brand of insanity had brought us back together. 3 weeks after I arrived, David called. I was in Robert's kitchen making dinner and humming to myself. Actually, humming something I hadn't done in years when my phone rang. David's name on the screen made my stomach clench with familiar anxiety. "Hello, dear. I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. Mom? His tone was strange, carefully controlled. I've been trying to call you. Your phone keeps going straight to voicemail. That was true. I had been screening my calls, not ready to deal with whatever guilt or obligation David might be peddling. I've been busy. Busy doing what I heard you checked out of the motel weeks ago. Where are you living? I looked around Robert's beautiful kitchen at the fresh flowers he'd brought home that morning, at the expensive wine glasses on the counter. I'm staying with a friend. What friend, Mom? You don't have any friends with money. His assumption stung partly because it had been true for so long after Richard died. I had let most of my friendships fade, too tired and too proud to maintain relationships when I had nothing to offer in return. You'd be surprised, I said coolly. There was a pause, and I could practically hear him processing that information. Mom, I think we need to talk. Valerie and I have been discussing the situation, and we think maybe we were too hasty. Maybe you could stay in our guest room for a little while, just until you get back on your feet. The offer that would have meant everything to me a month ago now felt empty, insulting even. What made you change your mind? Another pause. We realized we were maybe too focused on our own needs. Family should stick together. What he meant, I realized, was that he had probably heard through the neighborhood gossip vine that his mother was no longer staying in a cheap motel. Someone had mentioned seeing her with a well-dressed man in an expensive car. David was curious, and curiosity had made him generous. That's very kind of you, I said, but I'm perfectly happy where I am. Mom, you can't just move in with some stranger. It's not safe. What do you know about this person? I know he has never made me feel like a burden, I said calmly. I know he values my company and appreciates my cooking and tells me I'm beautiful every single day. The wedding was nothing like my first. When I married Richard 40 years ago, it was all about what others expected. White dress church ceremony reception at the community center with a DJ and a cash bar. We invited everyone we knew and several people we didn't particularly like, because that's what you did. We were performing the ritual for the community, not for ourselves. This time, Robert and I did exactly what we wanted. The ceremony took place in his backyard on a cool November morning, 5 months after that phone call in the motel. The minister was an old friend of Robert's, and the only witnesses were Linda the housekeeper and Michael, Robert's business partner and best friend of 25 years. I wore a simple blue dress that Robert said matched my eyes, and he wore a gray suit that made him look distinguished and handsome. No fuss, no pageantry, no stress of impressing anyone, just two people who had found each other again after 4 decades, promising to spend whatever time they had left together. David came to the wedding. I had debated whether to even invite him, but Robert convinced me to try one more time. He's your son, he said simply. You'll regret it if you don't give him a chance to make it right. So I called him 2 weeks before the ceremony. Robert and I are getting married, I said to David. November 15th at 2 p.m. You are welcome to come, but Valerie is not invited. He showed up alone, looking awkward in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. He shook Robert's hand politely, made appropriate small talk, and even managed to smile when the minister pronounced us husband and wife. But I could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he was taking inventory of Robert's house, his car, the obvious markers of wealth. This morning I woke up in Robert's arms, my husband's arms in the bedroom that has become ours, in the house that has become our home. The sunlight streamed through the windows overlooking the gardens we tend to together, and I could smell the coffee that Robert makes every morning before I wake up. At 66, I am happier than I have ever been, not because of Robert's money or his beautiful house or his success, but because someone sees me, truly sees me, and chooses to love what he sees. The fire took my old life, consumed it, and turned it to ash. But sometimes I think, as I watch Robert read his morning paper across the breakfast table, destruction is just another word for renewal. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to find everything you truly needed. And sometimes, if you're very, very lucky, first love gets a second chance to become forever love. The business card I kept for 40 years is framed now, sitting on Robert's desk in his office. A reminder that some promises are worth keeping even when it takes 4 decades to fulfill them. If you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our videos. And if you want to support us even more, consider becoming a channel member. You'll get access to exclusive content and help our community grow. Thank you for watching.